All right, I think we're going to get going. Welcome to the International Alliance of ALS MND Associations webinar about the headline results from the 2025 Fundamental Rights Survey. We will begin fairly promptly now because we have lots to cover, but this session will be recorded and available on the Alliance's YouTube channel shortly. For this webinar, we have captions available. If you are joining us live on Zoom, please check the chat box. Jess will be adding the instructions there, or scan the QR code on the screen if you have another device available. And if you're watching the recording on our YouTube channel, you will find the instructions in the video description on how to activate subtitles. Para este seminario web tenemos subtítulos en inglés y en español disponibles. Si se unen a nosotros en vivo vía Zoom, verifiquen en la casilla del chat donde Jessica está agregando las instrucciones o pueden acceder a la traducción por medio del código QR en la pantalla usando otro dispositivo. Y si está viendo la grabación en nuestro canal YouTube, encontrarán las instrucciones en la descripción del video sobre cómo activar los subtítulos. For this webinar, we are using automated captions. Please bear in mind that this kind of translation is not perfect. Many variables can affect the accuracy and some errors are possible. However, even if a few words are incorrect, you should still be able to get the meaning in context. And as we get started, we would like to acknowledge and thank our generous sponsors who made it possible for us to run this survey and share its results. So a big thank you to Biogen and Tanabe Pharma America. My name is Julia Simon. I will be hosting you today along with Kathy Cummings. I manage strategic projects at the Alliance, including this one related to the Fundamental Rights Survey. I'm also a former caregiver to my father who had bulbar onset ALS FTD. And I'm joined, of course, by the Alliance CEO, Kathy Cummings. Kathy lost her mom to bulbar onset ALS. And cares deeply about data and making effective data-driven decisions for the organization. Now, some final instructions before we get going. Any questions you have, please write them in the Zoom Q&A box. I also want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who pre-submitted their questions. There's a lot to cover, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So I'd like to introduce the PALS and CALS Advisory Council, also known as the PCAC. So this is a group of people who help the Alliance Board of Directors consider and include in its work the wide-ranging opinions and ideas of people living with ALS MND and their caregivers from across the globe. The PCAC reviews the fundamental rights annually, and the updated rights from the end of 2025 will be on the Alliance's website shortly. The 2024 version is currently there. Thank you to the subcommittees who worked hard on this. First of all, to the group who updated the fundamental rights, Albert, Alper, Bruce, Leanne, and thank you so much to the people who helped guided us on the survey wording. Equally important, Albert, Angelique, and Bruce. So this is an image screenshots of the fundamental rights themselves. The fundamental rights are the guiding documents for the Alliance, and this survey provides key data that supports the Alliance goal of accelerating outcomes in the fundamental rights of people affected by ALS MND. These screenshots of the fundamental rights are both for PALS, people living with ALS MND, and CALS, the caregivers of people living with ALS MND. In the interest of time, we won't go through them all, but Jess will share the link to them in the chat, or you can scan this QR code to access them. The fundamental rights are aspirational, and these documents represent the set of rights all Alliance member organizations should adopt and promote as conditions, systems, and resources allow. So this survey was run by an independent third-party research firm. The survey is run every 2 years, and this is its third iteration, so it began in 2021. It was in the field for just over 3 months, and we had 2,232 unique participants, with the breakdown that you see here between pals, CALs, and blood relatives. So those numbers don't add up to the 2232 because some people could self-identify as more than one persona or audience type. The survey was available in 16 languages, which we were really, really happy about. This was the first year we had an African language of Swahili, and we added 2 Asian languages, Vietnamese and Chinese, Taiwanese Chinese. And so we want to extend a very, very big thank you to our members who took time and effort to translate the survey into their language. It really makes it so much more accessible, and we really appreciate it. The survey was distributed on Alliance social media channels as well as through our member organizations, and with that, we got responses from 51 countries. This is a map of those responses. And so as you can see, we had the highest responses from the United States, Colombia, Canada, Turkey, France, Japan, the Netherlands, and Spain. I do just want to briefly talk about the global north and global south. So this is not a this is not a geographic distinction. I wanted to talk about this because you'll hear Kathy and I both referring to global north and global south over the course of this presentation. So the global north and global south divide classifies countries by socioeconomic, industrial, and political disparities rather than strict geography. The North generally includes wealthy, developed nations with advanced infrastructure. The South encompasses developing nations with lower income and higher population growth. And with that, I will pass it to Kathy to get into the data.
Thanks so much, Julia. And we've broken this presentation into different sections. As Julia said, we surveyed PALs, CALs, and blood relatives. So the first section that we're going to look at is the people with lived experience data. And we have 11 rights that are included in the fundamental rights of people living with ALS, MND. And we survey them on those 11 rights, but then we also do some drill down questions related to each of those rights. And this year we also did some survey questions on the path to diagnosis, assistive devices, and mental health. And our philosophy today is to not just show you the data graph after graph, but to tell you some of the so what behind the data that we're showing and why the results are the way they are. And before the survey is done, we set out a number of hypotheses that we either want to prove or disprove with the data that we collect. And the results of those are sprinkled throughout this presentation. So we're going to stay on this slide for a little bit because it's an important slide in the fundamental rights. This slide shows the each of the fundamental rights results and what the averages were for 2021, 2023, and 2025. So in 2021, the average was 44% across all rights. In 2023, the average was 52.3, and in 2025, the average was 67. So I want to address the fact that this data is reflective of a moment in time in 2021, 2023, and 2025. So it's not necessarily the same people answering the survey, and in fact, it's probably not the same people. So I see Kathy Collette's question flash across my screen, and we will answer questions later, but I'll address Kathy's question right now in terms of what do those averages mean. It is just the average, a simple average of each of the 11 rights and how well they are respected around the world. So it's the number of people that either agree or strongly agree with that particular right. And so I want to talk about these a little bit. The largest jump for these rights is in privacy and confidentiality, and the lowest growth in terms of respect of the rights is in remuneration, genetics, and treatment. And so we did have one of those hypotheses that I talked about a minute ago around the overall rights, which was that the respect for the fundamental rights has improved over time. And this became true, that hypothesis. 10 out of the 11 rights have increased since 2023, all except the right to live without discrimination. The other thing that's interesting about these rights is that having access to an ALS MND association or organization provides better respect of the 11 fundamental rights. So we ask people within the survey if they have access to an association or a society that supports them. And when they do have that, the access to the rights is, again, 10 out of 11 of them are better supported if you have access to an ALS or MND association. This isn't surprising to us because at the Alliance we believe that the MND and ALS associations are like the glue in the ALS MND community. And many of our associations that are member organizations offer direct care and support, like MND Scotland, for example, provides direct care through their nursing team. Acela in Colombia has recently added a grief support group to their roster. Argentina does a fantastic hybrid education series. And ALS Canada has recently funded a national genetics counselor to provide counseling and resources to all Canadians, no matter where they're located. So these are just 4 small examples of, and I could give you an example from every single member organization that we have, where the association bridges the gap between the clinic and the community and provides the supports that are necessary based on their cultural imperatives. And so the bottom line is that belonging or associating with a member organization or an ALS MND organization makes the lives of the ALS MND community better, which the data from the survey strongly supports. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the survey functionality. We have a number of filters. We collect demographic data to be able to analyze the impact of different aspects of people's reality in terms of how those rights are respected. So the kinds of demographic data that we collect are Global North, Global South. As Julia mentioned, that is a filter that we use fairly strongly. There are significant gaps that remain in the Global North, Global South dynamic in terms of access to different treatments and care and so on. A perfect example is on the slide, which is access to clinical trials. People in the Global North have better access to clinical trials than individuals in the Global South who are living with ALS MND. However, agreement is up in both groups, the Global North and the Global South. We also ask people whether they identify as urban or rural. And there's no notable distinction, which is surprising to me as a Canadian. I would have thought that the rural folks with ALS MND were more impacted by distance than other factors. There's actually a new study that was just published this week by the MGH team and Alison Boulat that Jess is going to put in the chat. And even though it's a fairly small study and geographically specific to the United States, the urban-rural divide is something that they looked at in terms of distance to a clinic. And interesting findings is that there are other factors that impact care and research more than just the distance to the clinic. So it kind of supports what we found in the survey as well. We also look at gender, and this becomes more important in the caregiver survey, I would say, in terms of 70% of the caregivers that responded are female, and 75% of the blood relatives that responded are female as well. We also look at English and non-English speaking, and that is done by the way the survey is completed. We don't ask people to answer a question on that. And English speakers are at an advantage over non-English speakers. So we're going to look at some of the specific rights. We will not be looking at them all, but we're looking at a couple of the big ones. Treatment is one of the fundamental rights that everyone living with ALS, MND should have access to the highest quality treatment. And you can see from this slide that 56% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that they had the highest quality treatments available. It's a notable increase from 2023, where it was 46%, and 2021, where it was 44%. But one of the lower levels of agreement among PALS rights in 2025. The level of agreement was higher in the Global North than the Global South, at 67% for the Global North and 38% for the Global South. And countries with the highest level of agreement were the US at 74%, Canada at 75%, the Netherlands at 84%, and Australia at 73%. And the lowest levels of agreement were in Turkey and Peru. We've also included clinical trials on the treatment slide, which sometimes researchers in the community kind of have to cover their ears when we talk about this, because clinical trials are not necessarily access to treatments. They're not access to approved treatments. But people in our community who feel they have agreement or strong agreement with access to the highest quality treatments are often those that participate in clinical trials. So there is a psychological connection between participation in clinical trials and your opinion about whether you have highest quality treatments available to you. And so we know from the clinical trials that 29% of PALs stated that they were currently participating or previously participated in a clinical trial, while 51% stated that they would be willing to participate in the future. 36% said they had no access to clinical trials. And when it comes to participating, those in the Global North reported a rate of 23%, much higher than those in the South of 6%. Lack of access was reported in highest numbers in Turkey, Colombia, and Peru. And this is something that the Alliance continues to address by working collaboratively with the 5 regional networks that cover the world: ELATAM in South America, NEALS in North America, NCALS in Europe, PACTALS in Asia Pacific, and the ALS Africa Network on the African continent. These 5 and the local networks like CALS in Canada, JACALS in Japan, and others are best poised to fix this problem in terms of working with industry and organizations around the world to bring more clinical trials to people in the global South. The next one we're going to look at is care. And care is, of course, one of the other big fundamental rights to have the highest quality care available. And you can see here that 68% agree or strongly agree in 2025, which is up from 51% in 2023. In the Global North, 78% agree and 51% in the Global South. 80% in English speaking versus 60% in non-English speaking. So again, this highlights why we use those demographic filters against all of our data, because we want to close those opportunity gaps for people to have the highest quality care available to them. There's no difference in urban, rural, or gender. And agreement is highest in Australia at 94%, the Netherlands at 89%, Canada at 87%, and the US at 86%. The lowest agreement is in Turkey, Brazil, Spain, and Italy. Multidisciplinary care is up from 46% in 2023. We do know through research studies that access to multidisciplinary care is important and extends the life of people living with ALS, MND, in some cases even longer than the treatments that are available. And so we want 100% of people living with ALS, MND to receive access to multidisciplinary care. There are some barriers to receiving multidisciplinary care, and the leading indicators were lack of availability in some places, high cost, and traveling far to access it. The support areas that we've highlighted on the slide are the areas that people receive support in around the world globally in terms of the care. We do look at this a number of different ways. We look at it by profession, but we also look at it by support areas, and you can see that 50% receive support in medication, 48% in mobility, 42% in adaptation to the home, and so on, down to toileting and hygiene at 33%. But the surprising note on the bottom of that little yellow area on the slide is that 12% do not receive support at all, and that has implications in terms of the quality of life that people are living because they don't have access to quality care. I'm just going to read this quote out loud. It's from Bernice Yu, who was a person living with ALS MND, who was a former member of the Alliance's PCAC. She said to us, "To live is not just to have my physical needs met and to be able to breathe. It's the other way around in terms of Maslow's hierarchy. I need to be able to love, to have belonging, esteem, and to be able to contribute and feel a sense of actualization. That is quality of life for me." So one of the fundamental rights is to live the best quality of life possible. And you can see on this slide that the agreement is up from 50% in 2023 to a high of 72%. And it's higher in the global north, 78%, compared to the global south at 60%. And in English-speaking countries, 81% versus 66% in non-English-speaking countries. The same is, it's about the same in urban and rural, and it's slightly higher in males than in females. In terms of countries, the quality of life is higher in Australia, 94%, the Netherlands at 93%, and US and Canada both at 84%. Japan at 79%, Argentina at 74%, France at 73%, and Brazil at 71%. This is something that the Alliance spends a lot of time on in terms of quality of life. And one of the hypotheses that we posed before the survey was done was it wasn't really a hypothesis. It was a more of a research question of how could we correlate the other elements of the fundamental rights to quality of life, and perhaps create an index that showed us what are the most important things that the Alliance and its member organizations need to lean into to increase the quality of life for people living with ALS MND. So our research company took our most recent data, and they looked at the 11 fundamental rights, and they matrixed those rights against the quality of life data that we received. And the strongest correlation was with choice, being able to choose who your healthcare providers are, where healthcare takes place. And so it really speaks to that autonomy piece of the human spirit and being able to make your own independent choices about how you deal with ALS, MND. The treatment and care elements that we've already talked about also showed up as strongly correlated to quality of life, and also end of life decision making had a strong correlation with quality of life. So this work is very nascent for the Alliance. We are going to go back and look at the 2023 data as well, and we're going to do this in two ways. We're going to look at how the 11 fundamental rights interact with each other in terms of quality of life, but then we're also going to look at some sub-elements of the survey where we look at things like assistive technology or communication tools and how they correlate with the quality of life, to see if we can determine which elements most strongly drive the quality of life agreement, or either strongly agree or agree. But we're also going to look at it in the negative. If people have said they do not have a high quality of life available to them, and so they strongly disagree, what are the elements that are driving that? Is it because they have lack of access to clinical trials? Is it because they have lack of access to communication? They don't have choice within the treatments. So this is something we're going to be working on over the next year, is to look at that quality of life index and developing that into a robust framework. One of the new elements we introduced into the survey this year was the diagnosis data. And much of what we validated through this data is borne out in the literature at the more local level and also through anecdotal evidence. This is an area that the Alliance has been working with My Name's Dottie Foundation on the Race to Diagnosis program to try and speed up referrals to ALS, MND specialists at a global level. This program is going to be available on our website shortly, and we're hoping that many organizations around the world will use that to speed up the diagnosis process. Often clinical trial programs have a 2-year window, so any increase to diagnosis time is challenging for our community because we don't want people to time out of clinical trial eligibility. So we have a couple of different statistics that we want to look at in the path to diagnosis. And these won't be startling to anyone, but they, as I said in my intro to this section, they validate what we have heard many times anecdotally. 54% of respondents had 2 referrals, diagnoses within the ALS MND diagnosis being the final one. 8% had only 1 referral, 24% had 3, and 14% had more than 3. So if you think about the path to diagnosis and the number of steps it takes to get there, obviously we want to minimize those number of steps. We had a number of hypotheses about the diagnosis research questions, and you can see that some of those hypotheses were proven not to be true, and one was proven to be true. So diagnosis takes longer in the global south than the global north. We had hypothesized that that would be true, and it was not shown to be true in the data that we received. We also said that diagnosis would be longer for females and younger people because ALS is often perceived as an older male disease, so more likely to be spotted. Again, that was not borne out by the data that we received. And we also said that a shorter time to diagnosis meant that people would receive higher quality care. And again, this was not proven to be true. And the last one was that more people were diagnosed by a neurologist than any other clinician, and that is true. We know that from the path to diagnosis work that we've done and reducing time to diagnosis that we've done with the community and with Costello Medical, that often it's that referral, the final referral to the ALS MND neurologist that results in the confirming diagnosis. The next section that I want to look at is the genetics data for people living with ALS MND, and this is a huge area of emphasis for the Alliance since 2021. In 2021, we added the 11th right, which was we're gonna show it later, but the 11th right is to have information, education, and resources about genetics, to have access to genetic counseling and testing, and to be safeguarded against genetic results. And so the first gene was discovered in 1993, so not that long ago, and the timeline from 1993 to 2023, when tofersen was approved, is exactly 30 years, and it's remarkable how much genetics has increased our understanding of ALS MND. There's been a lot of journal articles, and one in particular that comes to mind, actually there's one from Canada and one from Sheffield, that indicated that family history is not the only predictor of genetic ALS MND. And in a study done by Professor Dame Pamela Shaw, the objective was to determine whether routine genetic testing would have a significant impact on the subclassification that they did in their clinic. So they looked at 100 patients, and 7 had a family history of ALS MND, and the majority were apparently sporadic cases, but 21% of the 100 people that they looked at had a confirmed pathogenic or likely pathogenic mutation, and of those, 93% had no family history of ALS, and 15% of them met the inclusion criteria for a current clinical trial. So routine screening is something that we're quite interested in at the Alliance, and genetics overall, because it really increases our understanding of the disease. And we are big believers that everyone should have access to genetic counseling and genetic testing if they choose to have it. They should have the opportunity. Let's phrase it that way. So let's flip to the next slide. And so these are the results. Those who strongly agree that they receive the highest quality care are much more likely to receive genetic counseling than those who strongly disagree that they receive the highest quality care. Those who strongly agree that they receive the highest quality care are also much more likely to receive genetic education than those who strongly disagree that they receive the highest quality care. We do have a genetics task force that we convened last year, and we will be publishing those results later this year about global guidelines for access to genetic counseling and testing. And in most cases, people received genetic counseling. For those that did receive it, they received it from a genetic counselors, and genetic counselors are more common in the global north and in English-speaking countries. But that's, again, something that the Alliance is working on strongly to get more workforce support for genetic counselors around the world. We added a blood relative section in 2025. We didn't have this in the 2021 or the 2023 survey. And the reason we added the blood relatives section is because of that asterisk that you see at the bottom of the screen. When we added right number 11 about genetics in 2021 to the fundamental rights themselves, we had the asterisk that said, subject to education and counseling, blood relatives should also be given the same access where relevant. So adding the blood relatives section to the survey was to get at whether they had access to this particular right. So some of the results that we saw is that having a family history of ALS MND increases blood relatives receiving genetic counseling and testing, which is true. So that is one of the hypotheses that we posed before the survey was done. And having a family history of FTD also increases blood relatives receiving genetic counseling, and that was borne out to be true. So you can see the results here on the screen for the blood relatives segment of the survey, that 70% had not been offered genetic counseling, and 75% had not received genetic counseling, and 70% were not offered genetic testing, and 75% were not receiving genetic testing. So the segment is quite small that received both counseling and testing in the blood relatives part of the survey. In 2025, we, of course, surveyed our community that surrounds ALS, our community of caregivers, whether they are family or friends or other people within the community, healthcare professionals, and so on. We have done this since 2021, and you can see that the overall rights have changed from 39.5 in 2023 to 49 in 2025. So again, an increase, not as dramatic as the increase in the people living with ALS survey data. And you can see here that the rights of caregivers are slightly different in terms of the caregiver's rights to be supported, including things like respite and planning for their own future. And there are also rights around how they support the person living with ALS. All are important. So here are some of the CALS responses. Only 26% of caregiver respondents reported receiving support with regard to palliative care, and even fewer, 12%, received support for bereavement services. 22% of caregivers receive no support at all, which is a shocking statistic. I don't have time to go into it today, but Julia, who is our strategic projects manager, has a lot of thoughts on that support piece for caregivers, and maybe that's something that we'll do in a future webinar, because that 22% is appalling where they receive no support. In terms of the CALS research questions that we asked ahead of time before we received the data, there has been no change for CALS regarding regular training and resources to be better able to provide for the PALS at home. That is true. The majority of CALS worldwide receive financial support. That is not true. Caregivers' mental health is positively impacted for those who participate in a hobby outside of caregiving. That is true. Caregivers' physical and mental health are negatively impacted when they feel isolated, and that is true. And this is an area that many of our member organizations have been working on as well. So I'm going to wrap up my portion of the presentation here to talk a little bit about what some of the key takeaways are. And this is a picture of Norman McIsaac from Montreal. And the reason I wanted to put a picture of Norman on this slide is that we know from the diagnosis journey statistics that we have received in the 2025 survey and from anecdotal experience that a lot of people have more than one step to get to their diagnosis. Many had different referrals, and many people are misdiagnosed before they are properly diagnosed with ALS, MND. And I'm focusing on the diagnosis point because Norman gave us some feedback when we were showcasing the Breaking the News program that the Alliance developed a couple of years ago. Norman said that doctors have to remember that that point of diagnosis is literally setting the stage for the rest of a person's life. And so we at the Alliance want to take Norman's words to heart because that's where the fundamental rights kick in. If you've been diagnosed with ALS, MND, then you should have access to all those aspirational fundamental rights. You should have the best quality care, the best quality treatment, the best quality of life for whatever life is remaining with ALS, MND. So some of the key takeaways from the survey are that we know from that point of diagnosis that the community, the person living with ALS and their caregivers and the community that surrounds them will have an economic impact. One of the things we look at is remuneration, and 79% of PALs and 75% of CALs have been economically impacted by ALS, MND. We also know that people should, as quickly as possible, get involved with their local organization. 75% of PALs responded that they had access to an ALS MND organization that provided care supports. And we already know from the data that we looked at earlier that having access to that organization means that people have a higher quality of care available to them. Also, 29% of people are participating in a clinical trial, but 51% are willing to participate in a clinical trial. So from that point forward, from that diagnosed point forward, we want people to have access to clinical trials if possible, both in the global north and the global south. We also know that multidisciplinary care remains unequal in the global north and the global south, and that multidisciplinary care is a key aspect of what's needed to improve quality of life. And we also know that choice around the end of life, the choice to live as much life as possible, the choice, other choices as well, and the percentage of people who agreed or strongly agreed is quite impactful around that. And we know that it is one of the factors that the choice piece is one of the factors that influences that quality of life index. And so choice is the last thing that I'll talk about, which is more than just end of life. It's also the choice of health support workers and the location where care takes place. We know that authority to make your own choices is one of the most impactful pieces that shows through from the data. And I am just going to talk about discrimination for one quick second before I pass it over to Julia, which is even though that respect of that right has not increased since 2023, we still know that at least a third of PALS respondents experienced some form of discrimination because of their ALS, MND. And this is something we hear a lot of from our community in terms of people not talking directly to the person with ALS, MND if they have speech difficulties, talking to the caregiver instead, not being at the same height as someone, not having access to physical facilities, that kind of thing. And so this is, again, something that's a key takeaway from the data. So I know we've had to go quickly because this is a very data-rich survey, but Julia is going to talk about how we're going to continue to mine this data and use it in a meaningful way going forward.
Thanks, Kathy. In July of 2025, we held a focus group with subject matter experts to ask what next? What next for this project and our fundamental rights survey? So we are working to integrate that feedback, and over this year, we'll be producing materials for our members in the statistically significant countries, running focus groups to get subjective insights into this data. So, for example, we run focus groups around these topics. So these are some of the ones that we talked about today. But in addition, we also have information and education, assistive devices, and choice. We will also be creating reports, posters, and hopefully even a publication about the results. And also, hopefully, we're aiming to publish something about the quality of life index that Kathy mentioned earlier. So on that note, we want to thank you for being here, for your attention and presence. And we would definitely love to address any of your questions if you have any. And there are a couple that have been submitted. So we will take a look at those. And if you have any questions, you can add them into the Zoom Q&A box. So on that note, we had a question about specific countries. And so if your country is statistically significant, you will definitely hear from us. We'll reach out to our member organizations with the report from that country. Some questions, there was a question specifically about Switzerland. In those cases where there are less than the statistically significant threshold, so for example, if there are only a couple of responses, there won't be any data available specifically from those countries because there's not enough data to work with. We also had a question about what is the most violated fundamental right of people living with ALS MND? And Kathy touched on this briefly in her presentation of the data, but of the 11 rights, it's actually right number 11. So it's the right to genetics, counseling, testing, education, discrimination, safeguards, and access for blood relatives.
Can I just add to that a little bit, Julia?
Absolutely.
When we added the right to genetic counseling and testing and information, education, and resources about genetics in 2021 and the safeguarding piece, at that time, there were only 28 countries of 200 countries in the world that had a recognized profession of genetic counselor. And so we know that this is a problem, a multifaceted problem, but access to genetic counselors is certainly a barrier to that right being upheld.
Great, thank you. We have a question about, I think, the country to country. So we addressed that. So again, it depends on the statistical significance of the country. And then we have a question about the quality of life metric. Is the quality of life metric that refers to be best possible, perhaps settling for less, depending on the location? Does what is perceived as possible, in air quotes and quotations, in a locale cause people to score differently? Do you want to take a stab at that, Kathy?
How about you take a stab at it first?
No,
Because I want to think for 10 seconds.
no problem. Go ahead. I yes. So a lot of the data that we receive is subjective data. It's based on people's perception of what they believe or feel or think about a certain factor. So quality of life, I think, is a subjective for everyone, depending on where they live, what they have access to, what kind of care supports they have. So I would say that yes, it's likely influenced by where they live and sort of that the relative quality of life that everyone has as their own interpretation.
Yeah, I totally agree with how you answered the question. And I also wonder whether it's something that we have to build into our research question. As I said, we're at the beginning of this quality of life index analysis, and we're working with some other groups as well, not just with our own data, to see how they measure quality of life and the impact of that. And so I do think we have to take this question into our research question, which is, are there different indices if you break it down, perhaps by region, in terms of what's available for care and what's available for treatments. And we just did an approved treatments webinar last week at the Alliance, and we know there's stark differences in availability to approved treatments based on socioeconomic status of a particular country as well. So, that might drive impacts to quality of life too. So I think we need to build that into our research question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. There's a question or maybe a statement here. The diagnosis of MND ALS is a sentence to death. How doctors would like to say. So I think that question would be what you were mentioning earlier, Kathy, about what Norm's quote about the moment that diagnosis is delivered. So do you want to add to that or respond to this, or I should? I think so. We at the Alliance, there's another project that Kathy can mention, but we talk about how news is delivered and how this diagnosis is delivered. And so, yes, while a diagnosis of ALS and MND is a terminal illness, there is also a a way in which that can be done or certain considerations that can be upheld. So, for example, the location, the support people, the timing, the way it gets done. So we know that there are certain other factors that can, while not maybe reduce the shock and horror of that diagnosis, but that can make it as gentle as possible. So yes, I hear this question and it resonates very strongly with me because it is a life-changing nanosecond when you get that news. And we also know and believe that there is ways to make that transition as smooth as it could possibly be. Anything to add to that, Kathy?
No, I totally agree with everything you say.
Perfect. Another question was a operational one, which is it possible to have the transcript? So if you would like any additional material from this webinar, you can email Jessica and she can give you the information that you need. And here's a good question for, I think, both of us, Kathy. What was the finding that surprised you the most, or which was the least expected?
For me, that has been true across the last two surveys. I already mentioned this. I'm Canadian, and I live in a huge geographic country, and so the lack of differentiation between urban and rural is probably the thing that surprised me most. I expected that to have more of an impact on people's responses. And it could be that we're not reaching the true rural people, that they don't have internet access, or that they're not plugged into the networks that would distribute this survey, or it could actually be true that rural living doesn't necessarily impact the level of care or the access to treatment that you get and the other fundamental rights. So that's the most surprising thing to me. Yeah, why don't you answer, and I'll see if I can dredge anything else out from my memory banks.
Yeah, I think my response to this would be just the significant increase in the average over the last couple of years, both for PALS and for CALS. So again, as Kathy mentioned, this is data at a moment in time with the people that we happen to be able to reach at that time. But for me to see that the averages went up about 15% for PALs and about 10% for CALs. That was the least expected thing. I kind of expected a few percentage points or for it to be closer to the 2023 data. So either we're reaching people who have access to more of the things in the rights, or hopefully things are actually improving and increasing throughout the globe.
And I think in terms of the opposite of that question, things I wasn't surprised by, that things that validated what I had already thought or had heard anecdotally are important too, in that access to clinical trials in the Global South needs to remain a priority for the Alliance, because we're never going to understand ALS until we understand the whole world. And other things like improving quality of life for items like culture and sport and spirituality are important as being able to provide for the basic physiological needs. And, there are other validating factors, even around the diagnosis questions, which we just asked for the first time this year. We knew that it was multi-step. We knew that many people were misdiagnosed and that people hesitated to physicians who were not specialist ALS, MND neurologists hesitate to give the diagnosis, and that there are a number of referrals to get to that place. So to have validation of those pieces of anecdotal evidence is important for the work that we do going forward, and the specific projects that we lean into.
Yeah, and if I could add one more thing, I think it would be the quality of life, the very preliminary quality of life index correlation that we looked at. I think the fact that choice ranked so high or came up in that, and end of life choices as well, that piece that Kathy mentioned around autonomy. So I think some of the more obvious ones are treatment and care and the things that we've been talking about. But as she mentioned, that piece around spirituality, or the softer elements of the human experience, I think that's starting to show in the quality of life results, is something that's really exciting and interesting to dig into, because I think it's something that is often overlooked. And also the support, the lack of support. Kathy mentioned this around CALs, but we often look at the agree or strongly agree, and sometimes when you look at the disagree or strongly disagree, or the questions that have a no, I think those ones also are always jarring for me to see, no matter what the percentage is there, even if it's 12%. It doesn't seem like that much, but it's still 12% of people. So I think those, looking at where there's no support also is what I always find gives me a bit of a reality. So on that note, Kathy, are there any final, we've gone through all the questions that were asked. Are there any final remarks that you'd like to make as we close up this webinar?
I think there is one final thing about what you just said, which is also, I think as a community, we need to somehow figure out the caregiver paradigm and somehow relieve the burden of caregivers in the future. And I think it's something that we need to look at more closely, because this is such an impactful disease to caregivers. And so that, to me, is also a piece that we need to really lean into as well. And I think in terms of final thoughts, I appreciate everybody participating in the webinar today, but more importantly, I appreciate all the people living with ALS and the caregivers and the blood relatives that completed the data, completed the survey. It was a fairly long survey, and we appreciate the data and the direction that it gives the Alliance and our member organizations in providing services going forward. Thank you very much to the whole community, and thank you again to our sponsors who made this work possible.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. And on that note, we'll wish you a good day, evening, night, wherever you may be. And we'll see you next time. Lots more work and information from us coming about this over the course of the year. Have a great one. Thank you.